Good morning, everybody. It's John Selleck with the Build It Michigan Strong Coalition. We're supporting the brand new aggregates permitting legislation that's being introduced in the House of Representatives today by a really wonderful bipartisan group of state legislators, starting with our Appropriations Chair, Angela Witwer, Reg Reform Chair, Representative Tyrone Carter, and Republican State Representative Pat Outman. These bills are similar in nature to policy we've worked on in previous legislatures, and we think it's really notable that even though we are still working toward passing the bills, each term we've had leaders of the majority taking on this legislation because they can see while these things get played out at the local level, where we're struggling as a result is at the state level, and our ability to fix the damn roads like Governor Whitmer is working so hard to do. And that's why she has indicated support of this concept of this change, because she's spending at least $3.5 billion in bonded road funding money to get the roads fixed, to get the bridges repaired. And we're running into inflationary cost pressures. We're running into supply pressures and shortages. And frankly, the further these pits are moved away from the populated areas where these major job sites are, we're having to haul aggregate, sand, and gravel further and further. That means a semi-truck or hundreds of semi-trucks are making runs every day, putting carbon dioxide into the air and causing environmental outcomes that aren't being included by our opposition to these bills. But we're here to be on the more positive side and talk about things like the cost savings that'll take place. And when we talk about the labor force, why we have the support of three major unions, the operating engineers, the Teamsters, and the Michigan laborers, we have their support because they know as well as anybody that producing the next generation labor force is essential to Michigan being able to actually pull off this infrastructure improvement during Governor Whitmer's term and beyond. And if we don't have the jobs out there being done, if we don't save money and put it more efficiently into the actual infrastructure project instead of being lost to transportation and other problems, we can't train the next generation of workers. And that's something that they feel very strongly about. So with that right now, I'm going to introduce Doug Needham. He is the Executive Director of the Michigan Aggregates Association. Doug, please go ahead.
All right. Thank you. Good morning. As stated, I'm Doug Needham, the Executive Director of the Michigan Aggregates Association. And first, I'd like to start off by sharing a little bit about Michigan's aggregate industry. Our industry employs highly skilled workers who produce and deliver raw essential products like sand and gravel that's used to build our roads, bridges, and private construction. And we strongly support these bills because Michigan's crumbling infrastructure and strong economy are driving up demand for a limited amount of permitted aggregate supplies. And these permitted supplies are limited due to activists who intimidate local elected officials into delaying and denying the opening of new mines. We currently have a cottage industry of traveling so-called experts who are making their way around the state to break the aggregate supply chain with no constructive alternative, which is disappointing because we all benefit from the roads being rebuilt, sewer and water improvements, new local hospitals, along with the basements, driveways, and sidewalks that are needed for our homes. The list goes on. So when considering the billions being spent on our roads and being more in private construction, we need access to aggregate more than ever. This bipartisan bill package will repair our broken supply chain, and it will allow us to fix more roads because, as John said, when aggregate mining is permitted closer to major projects, trucking costs are reduced. That money goes back into construction improvements. It will slash CO2 emissions because trucks will travel fewer miles. It will put sand and gravel permitting into the impartial hands of environmental experts at Eagle, just like other extractive mining industries, including oil, gas, iron ore, and nickel. It will maintain local input. It will protect quality of life issues by setting sound and vibration limits, hours of operation, truck loading hours, setback requirements, berming criteria, and haul routes. And it will set requirements for post-mining land reclamation. And for these reasons and more, we support the permitting system proposed by Representatives Angela Witwer, Tyrone Carter, and Pat Outman. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Lance from MITA, please go ahead. Oops, you're on mute, Lance.
You'd figure after 3 years, you get used to this. Good morning. I'm Lance Benonimi, Vice President of Government Affairs for the Michigan Infrastructure and Transportation Association, or more commonly known as MITA. MITA represents over 500 companies that build our roads, bridges, underground water and sewers, dams, and other specialty infrastructure projects. Some of the material to build our infrastructure to last, we need the proper materials, and some of those materials are aggregates like sand and gravel. When aggregate supply chain does not produce enough to keep with current needs, road construction projects become more expensive. Our members believe too many aggregate mines are being delayed or denied, costing taxpayer money. Trucking has become one of the largest increases in construction costs over the past several years. Longer haul routes between pits and the construction sites mean higher costs and increased air pollution. Echoing the previous speaker, Doug, the Witwer legislation will support construction jobs, will help fix our aggregate supply chain, and most importantly, these bills will cut infrastructure construction costs significantly and allow the state to fix more roads and stretch taxpayer dollars even further. MITA stands strong alongside our partners, coalition partners, in supporting these bills, and we sincerely thank Reps Witwer, Rep Carter, and Rep Outman for their support today.
Thanks, Lance. In addition to having that general support of the concept of what we're doing here from Governor Gretchen Whitmer, I just want to remind everybody of the members of the Build It Michigan Strong Coalition. It's pretty broad and it's very unique in that it is business and labor. And we don't see that kind of a combination very often. It's fairly rare, other, I think, than outside of right now, the Line 5 project. So the operating engineers, Michigan Teamsters, Michigan laborers, the Michigan Chamber of Commerce, MITA, the Michigan Aggregates Association, obviously here today, Home Builders Association, Grand Rapids Chamber of Commerce, Asphalt Association, the Concrete Association, and even the Michigan Manufacturers Association. There's support all around the state from both union and labor. I think that's why, what again is unique is last term, we had Senate Majority Leader Republican Mike Shirkey as a real backer of this proposal. And this time, you know, on the Democrat side with them in majority, we again have their leadership pushing for this legislation in Angela Witwer and Tyrone Carter. So while we certainly acknowledge there's a lot of things that'll get talked about in the hearings about local control versus you know, a uniform statewide permitting system with the environmental experts at Eagle, we know when we make the argument that the best case scenario, and that's why all the support keeps happening on both sides, is that we need to look at the statewide need for the ability to rebuild our infrastructure. So with that, I'll open it up for just a minute for questions if anybody has one. Paul, hold on a second here. Paul Egan with the Detroit Free Press. Go ahead, Paul.
Hi, good morning. What are the significant differences, would you say, between these bills and the last set of bills that were introduced?
We've made, I'll take that. We've made considerable improvements on this bills as they've continued to make it through the legislative process. We have, as I mentioned, we've defined hours of operation. We have soil conservation plans that must be improved. We have added some timeframes for public comments and public hearings so that we can ensure that locals and local units of government have their input. So there has been considerable tweaking and movement on these bills as they've made it through the legislative process.
Okay, Paul, you have a follow-up?
Yeah, just one. I mean, I know there's a great range depending on the type of aggregate and everything, but do you have any data on, you know, aggregate costs today and delivery costs, and what you would project if these bills were made law?
Well, one of the topics we talk about is the haul distances. And so typically in the past, when we were rebuilding our infrastructure, there was a lot of haul distances that were like 30 miles from the sand and gravel operation to the job site. And that was about the same cost of material at about maybe $5, $6 a ton. Same cost of material, same cost to deliver. Well, the trucking costs have gone up, but so is the haul distances. So a lot of cases, we're not just going 30 miles or 60 miles or 90 miles. Sometimes we're traveling 100 miles in excess to deliver that same product to the job site. So at $6 a ton now for 30 miles of traveling, multiply that by 100 miles, we're paying significant more in transportation cost than we ever have in the past. And that's really where the huge cost increase comes into play, is the trucking.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Next up, we're going to have Beth LeBlanc with the Detroit News. Morning, Beth, go right ahead.
Hey, thanks for taking these questions. Can you clarify when you say when you refer to the involvement of activists on these debates, who you see as being the activists in these communities?
Local community members, really a lot of cases. What we're hearing when we go in to open up a new operation in a community, even though we want to work with the community and let them know, they say, you know what, we understand the need for the raw product and the sand and gravel. It is the building block of our infrastructure, but just not here. Don't put it in our community. Put it in the neighboring community or somewhere else. And that continues to be kind of a mantra that we hear as we go and apply for new locations. The sand and gravel is where Mother Nature laid it for construction grade material. It has to meet certain characteristics and physical qualities. And so we can't just go to the neighboring community in a lot of cases. We have to go where Mother Nature laid it. And that's the problem, is they just don't want it in their community.
Beth, I'd also mention that sometimes we are seeing the same names pop up at different places around the state. There seems to sort of be developing a cottage industry of folks who flock to wherever there's a permit that's put out. And we're seeing the same names of people proclaiming to be experts in X, Y, or Z or attorney firms, because they see the ability either just to stir it up or make a buck or something like that. And then the total ability to talk about what's really affecting at the state level is not happening. I mean, in a large sense, there's a lot of members who just feel it's almost unfair levels of pressure put on local officials, especially in a small community of 7 or 8 of your neighbors show up, a very small percentage of the overall area, and they're yelling and screaming in your face. It gets really hard to not think about your position in the community, or maybe more so your ability to get reelected. It's a tough spot they're in. There's a way to take this mining and match it up to several other of the mining industries that are currently handled for permitting at the state level at Eagle. So we just want to be in that realm and avoid that kind of cottage industry of like basically political campaigns that have popped up. With that, all right, we're going to take a question from Dave Eggert with Cranes. Dave, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to know if you had a projection on how many of these types of projects are on hold, or, you know, in theory could proceed if you know, the regulatory process has changed and, you know, Eagle has the permitting, does the permitting from here on out. Just how many around the state, or how many different mines could we see?
Right now, just real quick, I'd say we have easily a dozen that are being held up in either courts or through the delay process that the townships are doing. And those are scattered around the state. So I mean, theoretically, we could at least get some mines opened up here in a relatively short period of time, if we could get some reasonableness as through our application process. So we would have some access fairly quick. Now, this is not a fast process going through Eagle. There still is a lot of time for the whole permit process. But right now, we do have a number of them that are being held up.
Doug, could you talk just real quick? I promised everybody we'd keep it brief. It's a busy day. Talk about that delay process. It's pretty complicated, but there seems to be like a regular set of obstacles that are being put up once an application is about to be put in or is put in.
Well, when we work with communities up front and say, this is what we're planning on doing, a lot of times we get a nice warm shoulder saying, great, thank you for letting us know. We're excited to work with you. We go through the permit application process. We submit a full permit, and then we're informed that, hold on, we're putting a moratorium on mining in our township because we're going to redo our ordinance. They then take months to go through and redo and put in a whole bunch of hoops and roadblocks that are really unnecessary throughout this process. And then they come back and say, okay, now we're going to have you go back and redo your entire permit application. But first of all, we want you to determine that there is need in our local township for this material. And so they're putting in some added steps that really aren't currently required in the law, and they're making a determination before they even look at our permit application if the township itself needs the material. Now, we might be needing this material to rebuild I-94, 275, 94, 96, but the community says, well, that's really not important to us. We're looking for it just in our needs, and if we can't determine that our township needs it, then really we're not really going to take your application that serious. And so those are some of the hoops and barriers that we are being put through right now, that locals are looking more of just internally to their township and not the greater need of the residents in the state of Michigan.
Right. So when Doug talks about delay and deny, it really is often a two-pronged strategy. And the delay part is used quite regularly, starting with that moratorium process and essentially hoping to just stall something out or cause an aggregate producer to question whether they can financially get through the process and still actually build out the location. Because one thing that seems to be left out of the conversation sometimes is when it comes to supplies, these companies could not be expending all the money that they are to build these facilities out, to find them, to go through the permitting process, unless there was a market to sell it. Because obviously, if they can't sell the product, they'd go bankrupt. And that's not the case that we have right now. We have aggregate companies, like Doug said, across the state attempting to build out these facilities because the product is needed. That's why Governor Witwer has expressed interest and support in the general concept. That's why the Republicans were in the majority last time, and this time the Democrats are in the majority. They are all pushing for this. They see that there's a need to have some kind of reform while protecting still the ability of locals to have input at Eagle, to protect all the water, air, and ground permits that are necessary through Eagle, and including all these quality of life protections that Doug has mentioned, like noise, sound, fugitive dust, truck traffic, berming, and reclamation of the property. And I encourage you to go check out the Michigan Aggregates Association website and look for the link that talks about the Mining for the Future program. You can see some of the great work that's done with reclamation that eventually, and many times, causes the tax base to be higher after the project's over because of the housing and the waterfront property that's created, or the golf courses, or the public parks and softball diamonds, or the nature reserves, or even in some instances, property returned to the ability to use it for solar. So there's a lot going on out there. We'll talk about once committee hearings are scheduled. And then today, once we have the bill numbers, I'll share those with all of you. So again, I said I would be brief. It's a busy morning. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here today. You can shoot me an email if you have any follow-up questions at any point today or beyond. Thanks again. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.